All right, welcome everybody who is here so far. You are at our webinar featuring DeQuincy Lezine, and he'll be talking today about recovering, not only recovering, right? Correct me, but also growth out of the traumatic experience that often goes along with a suicide attempt or a suicidal experience. When you get a chance, Dr. Lezine, would you mind putting up the slides? And I will do a brief overview before we turn it over to you.
You bet. Hold on.
If it's the first time joining us today, we'd love to hear about that and let us know how you heard about us. But we'd love to hear where everyone's from. So those that are just joining us, please continue to add your comments and thoughts. So United Suicide Survivors International. This is a nonprofit that was formed several years ago with the intent to bring together people with lived experience. So not only people who had experienced suicide attempts, but also people who'd had suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors. So this whole spectrum of people and their experience related to suicide. And our board members and international advisory board members have both this type of lived experience, but also another type of lived experience. So I talked about how we brought on board people who had personal suicide experiences in terms of their own suicidal thoughts, but we also really strove, and this was the intent of the organization, to bring together people who had been affected by suicide because a friend or a loved one, a family member, a coworker, had attempted suicide, died by suicide, or been affected by suicide in some other way. And we really wanted to challenge the belief that those two groups could not work well together. And we'd seen plenty of successful dynamics happen, but we wanted to create an organization that empowers and develops people with lived experience, both their own personal and experience of those that they care about, to become better change agents, to understand the field of suicide prevention better, and to understand how to best tell their story and use their power as an individual, power based on their experience, to go and impact policy, their communities, and be prepared to do that in an informed way. So that's the background behind United Survivors. I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Not only is Dr. DeQuincy Lezine a long-standing expert in the field of suicide prevention, not only nationally but also internationally, but he's also somebody who's a dear friend of mine, and he has been working on what he's presenting today for quite a while. And one of the things that really strikes me about the way that he works is that he's balancing both this personal passion, this like internal drive that is emotion based, because he's a topic that's so near and dear to his heart that he cares passionately about, balancing that with this very logic, instrumental progression, bit by bit piece, which I think is sort of the ideal, that you can be both use your emotion and use your logic to go forward and create in the space of suicide prevention. So it is my distinct honor to introduce you to Dr. Lezine, who is a psychologist, does research in the field of suicide prevention, he and I collaborate and collaborates with a number of people, and he's got his hands on a whole number of things. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Lezine, and thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ursula Whiteside. Can you hear me? Let me just double check on that.
Yes, we can.
All right, cool. So what I wanted to do today was talk about how to turn things around. In a lot of ways, this kind of parallels my own journey in suicide prevention, which goes kind of from a focus on preventing suicide to a focus more on personal growth as something to think about. So the first thing to talk about is the elephant in the room. And I mean this kind of literally. Why do we think about the elephant when not told to? So the prior slide, I had a specific instruction to do not think about an elephant. Don't picture an elephant. But if you're like most people, like me, you probably thought about the elephant, pictured an elephant at least for a little bit. And the reason why is because the sentence is framed around the elephant. It's a sentence about elephants. It's to say, don't think about it, but the only way to get our minds to not think about it is to first think about it and then try to put it out of our mind. Now that would be a lot easier if you had never seen an elephant before, because then you wouldn't have an image of it at all, and thus it would be a pretty simple thing to do to not think about an elephant. You would just think about something different. But you could imagine if you're somebody like the guy who took this picture when I was riding on this elephant in Thailand. This is somebody who works with elephants all the time. So if you are this person, it would be almost impossible to not think about an elephant, especially if you see a word elephant that appears on the prior slide. But then think about it if I said picture a chocolate bar. So if I said that, the likelihood is that you would not have thought about an elephant at all. Probably even the person who works with elephants all the time would not have thought about an elephant if I said picture a chocolate bar. And you will see in a little bit how this relates to suicide prevention. Let's talk about the first part, how thinking about the elephant relates to suicide prevention. If somebody has experience with suicide, and we ask them to get away from suicide, but we're focusing on their risk for suicide, then we can expect that that person is going to keep thinking about suicide. Even if we're talking to them about suicide prevention, and we're talking to them about reducing their suicide risk, what we are doing is to continue focusing on suicide because all of our frame is around suicide. Now, like with the elephant, it would be easier to accomplish this with somebody who has no experience related to suicide at all. They would probably be very happy to not think about suicide, to avoid it if at all possible. But the people with the highest risk for suicide also have the most relevant experience, and so they are like that person who works with the elephants all the time. It's almost impossible for them to not think about suicide if you are mentioning suicide all the time. So that's why I say that we need to kind of turn this around, to think about it in terms of the way our brain processes things. If you say suicide prevention, the first thing to think about is suicide. And thus, if somebody is already thinking about suicide, it's really hard to get them to stop thinking that way if we keep talking about it that way. So I want to talk about this, don't falling again. There's often used analogy that talks about a river or a waterfall. The way the story goes is that there's somebody who's at the edge of the river or the waterfall, and they're trying to save people who are in there. And they're pulling people out, pulling people out, pulling people out, getting really exhausted, pulling people out. And so then somebody comes along and says, you know what, I'm going to go upstream. I'm going to go up there and try to stop people from falling into the water. And it makes a lot of sense. You go upstream, and that helps to prevent people from ever going into the water. And so this kind of gives a contrast between crisis services or crisis intervention, which is still needed because some people do go in the water, versus upstream prevention, which is getting there before they even go into the water. Now, for a very long time, I liked this example, and I still kind of like it. But the thing to think about is, what if somebody has already gone over and they survived? So now they're at the bottom of the waterfall looking up. So now, do we give up on them and say it's unsuccessful as an intervention because they went over the waterfall, so we missed them, and therefore just give up? Or do we give them information about not going over waterfalls to say, don't go over a waterfall in the future? So we're up at the top, and we're looking down on them and saying, beware of waterfalls. It's not going to be as helpful to them as to maybe turn and look at something quite different. I think that we can do something better than only offering them information about not going over waterfalls in the future. On the flip side, there are people who focus primarily on health and wellness, and I think that that is great as well. I spent some time in the health promotion field. And a little bit light on this, that there's rain in the rainbow. Mostly because on the prevention side, we sometimes include mental health promotion, and when we're talking about it before a crisis happens. So when we have intervention diagrams, we sometimes include mental health promotion. And if we do, then it's done before a crisis happens. So it's like mental health promotion, and then prevention, and then intervention, and then you have postvention and aftermath or after attempt services. So when you're talking about mental health promotion, most of the folks who focus on that rarely, if ever, include suicide in their diagrams or their talks. So we have these two extremes then. We have the folks who are on the suicide part who rarely talk about mental health promotion, and then folks who are on the wellness part who rarely think about suicide. I just want to stop for a moment and say that you'll notice that I tend to keep things light sometimes. And this is purposeful. I don't think that it's possible in my theory or philosophy, it's not really possible to fight darkness with darkness. You have to fight it with something light. It's hard to get people to get lifted up, to lift up their spirits, if we are always talking about things in a heavy way. And thus, I don't want to make it seem like this is not serious. We know that it's very serious, but it's not something that I think we need to be morose about all of the time. And so it's very purposeful to shift that a little bit. That'll make sense even more as I go through this talk. So why is it that the people who are focusing on health and wellness hardly ever talk about suicide? It's pretty easy. Stigma. But it's rational stigma. Why would people want to think about death? It doesn't make sense. If somebody is thinking about death, then they're not going to be as focused on life. So a lot of people want to avoid that. But what happens is it makes it very difficult then for us to include them as partners in suicide prevention because they don't want to think about suicide. And remember, when we talk about suicide prevention, we're immediately having people focus on suicide. Now, of course, there's a good reason why we have shifted the focus specifically to suicide. For the longest time, and even right now, there's not a lot of awareness, not a lot of attention, and definitely not a lot of prioritization of suicide as a topic to address. And thus, we have really tried to overcompensate for that. We say that since most people are not being aware of suicide, we need to specifically focus on suicide the entire time. That way we can compensate for what's missing. So I think it's rational on both sides why folks would avoid suicide, why folks would pay attention to suicide. So what's happened after that is we've declared war on suicide, at least recently. We have the statement from the AAS. AAS, the American Association of Suicidology, calls for $1 billion war on suicide. The CDC reports record-setting increases in suicide. So we're trying to respond to suicide at the same scale as what the problem is. Now, it's interesting about war. One of my favorite books is actually Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And if you look at how folks actually win at war, one of the most useful procedures is called flanking. And with a flanking maneuver, what happens is that the force is kind of split up. And so one side continues to attack from the front, and the other part of the army goes and attacks either from the side or from the opposite side. This type of maneuver has been used in pretty much all of the successful war interventions. So if you look at things that Hannibal did, things that Caesar did, ways that Napoleon won, and then Sun Tzu in Japan. So all over the world, different strategists, different generals have come up with the idea that this flanking maneuver is a very, very effective way to win a war. We haven't really approached suicide that way, but I'd like to suggest that we do. And here's what I mean a little bit more specifically. In some ways, we've been engaged in more than 60 years of a tug of war with suicide. So suicide's on this side, and it's pulling over here towards death. And so to counter that, what we did is create suicide prevention, which pulls this way towards life. Now, what I'd like to suggest that we do for the flanking maneuver is for a small number of people who are familiar with this side of death and suicide to go back over to the other side and push against suicide. So imagine a tug of war where you have these both sides, and in some ways, honestly, we've been losing ground. So you have this tug of war, and we've been losing a little bit of ground. How do you think things would shift if somebody went to the other side and gave them a shove? Now you have two parts pushing against suicide, and that's a flanking maneuver. It's what has been used successfully in actual combat to win a war. Now, the fun thing about this, fun to me anyhow, is that when you do this and you have folks who are working for suicide prevention but facing the opposite direction, now they go from being back to back with the people in suicide prevention, because remember, they want to focus on the rainbow. And now, since you're on the other side, they can now be happy allies because they don't have to look at the death side. Now they can look towards the rainbows, and they are allied with the people who are focused on health and wellness from the opposite side of suicide. Those are people with lived experience. They're people who are familiar enough with the darkness to go onto that opposite side, and yet are familiar enough with the suicide prevention side, with the light side, to be able to bring that perspective back over there. So here's what I think. When you're in crisis, you focus on the crisis. So if you trip and fall, it's appropriate to look at the ground because that's where you're falling to, and you want to brace yourself so that you don't completely fall. You put your arms out, you look at the ground, and that is appropriate to do. Now, for that in suicide prevention, we have guidance like what is presented at crisisnow.com. And those are things like providing crisis stabilization services and having mobile crisis services for people. And then on the individual side, you would want to do things like accessing the suicide prevention lifeline or calling the crisis text line, and that would hook you into that crisis system. So on the system side would be to improve the crisis systems so that they are more comprehensive, more prone to work together, and more accurate in what they do. And then on the individual side, to have consistent ways that people could be connected to those crisis systems. So then when you're getting back up, you're starting to recover, it's appropriate to push off against the ground. And therefore, you're again facing the ground, and that's appropriate to do so because you're just starting to recover. So this would be something like safety planning. You figure out what to do, ways to distract yourself, ways to cope with suicidal urges, and who can help. And the focus here is on the crisis side. It's on that risk side because it's just starting to recover. But the question is, what happens after standing up? Once a person has already done the basic recovery, once they are stable and they're no longer in crisis, do we say that we are done? We're finished. But they are still left standing and not really sure which way to go. So we have this phrase, things going south. And you can imagine if somebody had been going along and things turned south. And that's when they tripped and fell. It would be good advice to tell them to avoid going south. It makes sense. That's how you would avoid falling. But you can do this in a lot of different ways. One way is to just stand still, and you might be facing south. Now, there's a problem here because that is meaning that we can be successful by having people do nothing. The other thing is that if somebody takes a step forward, it means that they're going south again, and so they might fall, which is completely illogical to tell people that going forward is the wrong thing. And the best way to do would be to go backwards, or maybe to the side. So that is not going to be as effective in terms of really turning things around for them. Now they could step off to the side, to the west or to the east, and that might be helpful at some points in time, but not as helpful as it would be to go north. Now to focus here on the south side, This is the prevention orientation. It's to say we are preventing the death. Again, the focus is on suicide. Preventing suicide, but it's on the suicide. So that is the focus. That's the direction that people are facing. On the opposite side is the recovery orientation. So I say go north. We don't even mention south. We're talking about going north. That's the recovery orientation. But the result of going north is you're not going south. We know that there are things like southwest, there's southeast, but there is no such thing as north-south, because going north is the exact opposite of south. Therefore, suicide prevention and a recovery orientation are very consistent with each other. They're very compatible. Once you have achieved the suicide prevention side, then it's good to switch to more of a positive recovery or growth side. So let's say that somebody has stood up, they're doing this recovery orientation that we're talking about, and they decide to make some progress, to go uphill. So let's talk about making progress then. The slow way to make progress is to still face backwards, to still face south, to face towards suicide. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried walking uphill facing backwards, but you can imagine that if you did, it would be a good way to fall on your face. That's because your center of gravity is still too far backwards, which is why nobody really tries to do this. We face the opposite direction. Or if you're driving, imagine trying to drive uphill in reverse. Folks don't try to do this either, because it doesn't make sense to try to use reverse in order to go in a particular direction. The faster, easier way is to turn around to go uphill. And that's what I mean by facing north, facing that recovery orientation, turning things around. Now, I'm not saying to get rid of everything else. Even when you're going uphill, it's useful sometimes to step on the gas, to step on the brakes. See, I recently went up to the mountains over here. I live in Fresno and Central California, and there's a spot nearby that I really enjoy going to called Kings Canyon. And up there, there are many of the famous sequoia trees. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but everybody is either going up or down the mountain. And so that's one of the reasons why I think about this analogy a lot. And even when you are going uphill and primarily using your gas, there are times where you need to brake, particularly if you start sliding or if you're going around a curve and you want to slow down. So we're not saying get rid of the brakes. We're not saying get rid of reverse. We're saying keep those in case things are needed, but you're going to focus on going the opposite direction. So going up the mountain. Meet General Grant. General Grant is the name that was given to this famous sequoia tree. It's 40 feet in diameter. It's the third largest tree in the world according to volume. And it's a trauma survivor because it has survived many fires. This tree is about 1,700 years old. So you can imagine it has been through many, many forest fires. Resilience is that ability to recover. It's to go through the fire and to not die in the fire, but to be able to bounce back from it. And this tree has been able to bounce back many, many times over the century. Having growth after the trauma, though, that's post-traumatic growth. Remember, this is the third largest tree on Earth. That means that it continued growing even after fires happened. So a fire happened, and then it recovered, and then it kept growing afterwards. That's post-traumatic growth. Its ability to develop beyond the prior level of functioning in the aftermath of some stressful life event. Some of the related concepts that folks use here are thriving, finding benefit after a trauma or after a crisis, or called stress-related growth. Now, a lot of times, the things that they focus on in terms of post-traumatic growth are things like a changed perspective on life, or a renewed commitment to your interpersonal relationships, or a change in a person's spiritual beliefs or spiritual relationship. One of the reasons why I love General Grant as the tree, besides being the third largest, the first reason I kind of fell in love with this tree is that it has an immense fire scar on the opposite side of this picture. And it shows how much it had been damaged by fire, so much that it has this really lasting mark on it. And yet it continues to survive and thrive. So then fire. Fire is intense and it's dangerous. And it's something that is useful in terms of an analogy. I really like the analogy that Dr. Ursula Whiteside has created around fire, and that's at nowmattersnow.org/get involved. And they're thinking about fire prevention, which is thinking ahead, planning for a fire. That's something like getting a fire extinguisher, making sure you have an escape plan, an exit readiness plan. And so for us in suicide prevention, that's like doing safety planning. It's getting prepared ahead of time in case there is a fire emergency. Then when there is in a fire, would be one level, and there are suicidal urges, there's high emotional pain, and you want to figure out ways to lower that level of pain. These are the variety of different options that somebody would have that would be included in the earlier parts of safety planning, right? Using distractions, talking to other people and recruiting help with distractions, being able to use some of the skills that are developed in dialectical behavioral therapy, and those can be found at nowmattersnow.org. And then the last level would be to be on fire. And there's a suicidal emergency. That's when a person's in extreme pain. It's almost to the unbearable amount of pain that leads to a suicide attempt. Now, the thing that I'd like to say, though, is fire, in a lot of ways, is like we have for suicide prevention, where the highest attention goes to the crisis period. So that's why on news media, they'll focus on blazing fires as they're going, and maybe a little bit on the prevention side. So more about preventing forest fires or how to prevent future fires, but pretty much nothing about after the fire. And so that's something that we need to attend to in suicide prevention as well. So suicide prevention, but then what happens after a suicidal crisis has happened? What happens after the fire? So back to our trees, once upon a fire. I'd like you to meet Baby Grant. That huge tree started from this tiny seed cone. As it turns out, fire helps sequoias get started. And therefore, the sequoia is not just able to withstand fire, not just able to grow after a fire, but it's actually fire adapted. They grow fast. That way they have a chance to reach sufficient heights before another fire happens. They have fire-resistant bark. Their canopies, meaning most of their leaves and foliage, is really elevated so that fires are less likely to get to it. And then the cones are fire responsive. They primarily open during a fire. So when a fire comes through and it wipes out most of the other vegetation and it clears a path for them, that's when the seed cones are most likely to open up and help possibly a new young sequoia get started. So in these ways, they have not just been able to survive fire, but have adapted to it. It's more specific to fires. And for us, I use the term post-suicidal growth. It's a special kind of post-traumatic growth because it does happen after a trauma, but it uses specific use of the suicidal experience to inform the growth. And here's more specifically kind of what I use as the model for this. Things that would be kind of on that prevention orientation side. That's stabilizing and then recovering. Remember, this is when I said if somebody trips and falls, you're focused on the ground. You're focused on first stopping yourself from hitting the ground as hard, and then on pushing up off the ground so that you could stand back up. That's what we have a lot of times for the prevention orientation. But then, once a person is standing, I would suggest post-suicidal learning to reflect on things. And after somebody has reflected, it's possible to shift in the direction of recovery and growth. And there somebody is trying to learn and therefore apply what they have learned in a way that they can grow. So, if safety planning is plan B, then what's plan A? Usually people use the term plan B when something has gone wrong. So, you have to switch to plan B. But that means that there was a plan A. There was something that came before that. So safety planning, I think, is plan B. And you can use reflection to inform future plan Bs, stabilizing and recovery. So after a crisis, somebody would use reflective time to improve the safety plan, to come up with a better plan of action the next time around. And in that way, this process of kind of going from stabilizing and recovering and then reflecting afterwards can improve what happens in the future in terms of having stabilizing and recovery. But then I have post-suicidal growth planning. What does a post-suicidal growth plan look like? There is that reflecting aspect, but not just to inform the crisis side. I think that reflection could include getting at a person's strengths and assets. Now, this is the flip side of their risk factors. Some of these are protective factors, and some of these are wellness factors. Some of these are life factors. And then priorities for quality of life. And that's kind of the flip side of saying what a person's needs. So psychological needs is one way to look at it, and their priorities for quality of life is another way to look at it. I did a series fairly recently, a video series on incorporating a growth perspective into safety planning. And one of the things that I talked about in that is when we look at a person's psychological needs is something that we've talked about in terms of preventing their suicide. But a psychological need is really a priority for somebody. It's something that somebody values so much that losing it seems worse than death. And so it is a high priority for them. Sometimes it's not something that they realized was that important as a priority to them until they hit that point where death seemed preferable. So this helps us to identify what a person's priorities are for their quality of life. And then the next step would be learning. And that's picking up new skills to learn. Those could be interpersonal skills, coping skills, problem-solving skills. A lot of the things that we have identified as being risk factors, as being gaps that lead a person towards being more suicidal or not being able to recover quickly from being suicidal. These are skills that are useful for resilience as well as useful for planning going forward. And then resources for learning. This is kind of the opposite side of having those crisis response resources. So we want to make sure that people have that safety net, that they have those crisis resources. So this is that lifeline, crisis text line, making sure that they have the crisis stabilization and mobile crisis services. That's really focused on the resources in case somebody slips, in case they fall. But we also want to have focus on what their resources are for learning. And one way that this attaches to something I was talking about earlier in terms of folks who want to focus on wellness and not necessarily focus on the death side is this is somewhere where we can connect to spiritual and faith leaders. This is somewhere that we can connect to everybody who's talking about growth and enhancing quality of life and improving where a person is. And they don't even have to talk about death at all because all they are doing is focusing on life. And we say that we want to focus on life too, and that makes them allies immediately. And it doesn't matter to them if one of the things that we have as a goal is also pushing away from death. they could just focus on the life side, and that brings them into something that's aligned with safety planning. So then the last part is growth, and that is actually having opportunities or a plan of action to put into practice those new skills that have been learned to make use of those resources for improving a person's quality of life. So really what this is taking the positive present, that's reflecting on those strengths and assets and priorities that a person currently has, and then thinking about their desired goals, what they're trying to achieve, where they're trying to go in life. And then the learning part is inside. It's bridging the gap between what they have at present and where they want to be in the future, where their desired goal for the future. And then you can look at the distance between those two, and that's how you identify the skills that would be most useful to learn and the resources that are most useful to learn. In this way, you're making specific use of what we have found out from their suicidal periods, and trying to connect that to values such as we described in the way forward, like having a focus on a view of the future, right? Hope, meaning, and purpose, and things like having respect for cultural and spiritual beliefs and practices. These are specific ways that we can bring these to bear in a way that's relevant to suicide prevention, and not necessarily something that is always talking about or focusing on the suicide aspect. So, to present my contact information, and you can look at more about post-suicidal growth at livedexp.academy. There's also some guidance for that. I've developed it's kind of an assessment, I suppose, that allows people to kind of check how things are going for a few different milestones for each of those stages that I was talking about previously. Let's see, that's here. For the stabilizing, recovering, and then reflecting, and then learning and growing to see how folks are doing in terms of hitting those milestones, and then be able to move forward from there with making their own plan for post-suicidal growth. I think that it's really important for us to take advantage of the information that's already being developed as part of risk assessments, as part of safety planning, something that we already are starting to gather when we are doing things like doing the comprehensive suicide risk assessment. So we're already talking to people about things that are incredibly important to them. And thus far, we have primarily focused on using that in terms of predicting their risk, predicting when they might become most suicidal. But it's that same type of information looked at from the opposite perspective that allows you to see what a person values most, what is going to be most important for us to try to increase or enhance to make their quality of life better so that they choose life instead of choosing death. So that's what I have for now in terms of post-suicidal growth and safety planning, as well as growth planning. And now I'll turn it back over to Dr. Ursula Whiteside, and let me know when you want those last couple of slides, Ursula.
Okay, great. The Lived Experience Academy came out of the need for a sort of next step and a focus on not necessarily a clinical or healthcare focused support or growth piece. And I'm curious about, people who might say, like, people need to see a clinician. They shouldn't be doing this on their own or trying to figure this out on their own. Or I know your Lived Experience Academy gives really great examples of how to do this and helps walk people through it. For people who that's their first response is sort of a fear response. What do you think about that?
I think that it makes a lot of sense for folks to kind of have a fear about the risk because the consequences can be significant, right? They can be very dangerous, the loss of life. And I think that when you are looking at that crisis side, staring at the ground, there's only a few things that you really need to pay attention to. And so that's why we would focus in on kind of that crisis stabilization, on safety planning, on taking care of that suicidal risk. But I think for most of a person's life, they're not going to be suicidal. And thus we have to pay attention to that part as well. Or if we don't, then we're just keeping them in that suicidal space. Recently, I think at the last AAS conference, one of my old colleagues, Peter Britton, did some presentation about motivational interviewing. And there they were finding that they used to spend the same amount of time talking about a person's reasons for dying and reasons for living. And then they have better results now when they shift to spending a little bit of time on the reasons for dying, but primarily focusing on those reasons for living. Spending most of the time there gets a person's mental framework towards life, and therefore they're looking in the more positive direction. And you still have the attention to the negatives. You still have those breaks in case you need them, but you're still going to be focusing primarily on the positive direction. So I would see therapy that's focused specifically on suicide as kind of being those breaks. They're the emergency in case you start to slide backwards, in case things are going negative. It's good skill sets to have. But then there are things that you would be able to pick up from a wider variety of resources, including things like the Lived Experience Academy, including things that talk about health and wellness for going forward.
Okay, great. Cheryl had a good question, and I'm just seeing if she's still online so that we could have her ask it directly, but I think she's on here we go. I think she might be on the Facebook Live version.
Okay.
What her comment was really about, you were talking about trauma and describing a mental health crisis as a form of trauma. And did you intend to do that? Is that intentional?
Yes, it is. I think they can very often be traumatic, both to the person who is experiencing it as well as to the persons around them. It is a significant event that has the possibility of death, and that's the pretty much the definition of significant trauma. And it's something that can be long-lasting. It's something that can have its own effects. In the downside, it's something that could have effects that are pretty similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. And therefore, I think on the upside, there's also possibilities for something similar to post-traumatic growth.
Okay, thank you. Zachary Rodriguez asks, what do you think about the lack of lived experience information in the suicidology literature?
I think it's something that we've been trying to correct recently, but I think that it is something that has been kind of difficult to take place. I think one of the things that makes it difficult is just kind of how academia is set up, as opposed to how people who have lived experience might be focused. If you're thinking about lived experience, you're thinking about things that are fast acting, like we were talking about fire, right? Fire is a fast moving substance. It's not something that's going to wait around for doing multiple reviews on grants or waiting around for multiple reviews of a research article. So a lot of those folks are looking for help right now. They're looking for things to change right now, and they're looking for pretty fast feedback about what's going on. So therefore, I think you have to be at kind of a further away from that suicidal experience to be at the point where you can look at it in that kind of long-term view that's needed for the type of research or academic research that leads to publication in scholarly journals.
I'm curious about what, in your ideal world, what would it look like for someone who was going through a suicidal experience? So let's say that this was their first really intense experience and they ended up being psychiatrically hospitalized, and they leave, no longer being acutely suicidal, but still having some suicidal thoughts. In your fantasy world, what would the progression look like for the next year, and then beyond?
What I would want to happen is for them to be able to take the information that they got from that inpatient experience with their discharge paperwork and with all of that, and be able to take that to people who are helping them in the community. That could be anybody from family members to professionals, peer professionals, or other folks who are going to be helping them to go in that positive direction. One of the things the safety plans are designed for is sharing with other people, right? Or at least using other people as resources. So you're sharing some information with them, disclosing to various degrees. And when you're doing that, I think that those are folks who can help you to refine that then, and not have the safety plan be this kind of static thing that doesn't ever change, this piece of paper that's never ever going to change. It's something that should be improved over time as you learn more about yourself, as you get more skills, as you gain more resources. And thus it could be something that is updated. And one of the things that I mentioned in kind of the video series was if you're updating it more regularly, then you're more familiar with it. And therefore, you're more likely to use it in case of an emergency, as opposed to something that just kind of sits there and the therapist is not really familiar with it because it seems completely distant from what they are doing. So now if a person is a therapist who's either focused on suicide or focused on counseling towards growth, either way, they can become familiar with that safety plan because they're using it. Even if it's for different purposes, they're still using it. So I think that over time, then, they would be taking those elements that they got from the inpatient setting, elements that they got from the risk assessment setting, and then the person who is helping them or them themselves are able to look and systematically go through those different informational elements and look at how they might be useful for planning for future crisis response, as well as how they might be useful in terms of self-awareness, and therefore things that they might want to improve going forward or change going forward.
Okay, great. Julio has a question as well. And Julio, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks very much. So I am in the early stages of planning an outreach event with lived experience speakers, and without there being research to show it's effective, what ways could I at least ensure that the speakers are in a good enough place to, in a sense, speak at something like this without anyone being more or less worried that they're going to put themselves in higher risk for speaking at an event about surviving a suicide attempt?
There is some guidance that's been developed. It was available at AAS, and for at least for a while, it was available in Australia as well. The Lived Experience Network down there created something to guide for speakers who are going forward. There's also information that has been developed for people who have a mental health condition in terms of becoming speakers. And there's been a lot more developed there for their peer services than we have. The peer specialists have their own certification levels. And so those, if you're looking for the most formal aspects of what somebody would want to have in place, you can look at those peer specialist certification elements. A lot of those are available online or through SAMHSA. In terms of the suicide prevention side, we haven't gotten that specific yet, but there is that general guidance that's available at AAS.
And Julio, yeah, and Julio, Quincy doesn't know this yet, but we just piloted a Udemy course that is how United Survivors piloted a Udemy course on this, and you're welcome to be a reviewer of that if you'd like an early access and to give us some feedback, but that should be out by April. Also, there's a storytellers event we're planning for the weekend after the AAS conference. That's suicidology.org if you want to learn more about it. And that would be with United Suicide Survivors International as well, with the focus on developing your storytelling skills so that you can do outreach events and train other people and leave feeling confident. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any further interest in that.
I'd say the ideal in my mind as well is for people who are planning to be at the level of like public disclosure for speaking events or for being as a peer specialist, to have that as kind of their stage 5 goals. So those are the things that we would want to bridge between being at the crisis level, having those strengths and assets identified, and then knowing where they want to go in terms of being a speaker, or in terms of being a peer specialist, or in terms of being an advocate, and then be able to bridge the gap between those two things by looking at the skills that they might need to learn in terms of either self-care or things like just storytelling elements, to either specific skills for the job themselves, or skills in terms of taking care of themselves.
Great, thanks again.
Great question. Julio, do you want to say just another sentence or two about where you're from? You're new to us.
Oh, sure. I'm in Laramie, Wyoming, and I work for the University of Wyoming's Counseling Center.
Well, so glad you're here. Thank you.
Thanks.
And a lot of the people on the webinar are probably new to you, DeQuincy, because they're new to United Suicide Survivors International. But would you mind saying a little bit about how you got into the field and, the timeline for that? Because you were doing this before anyone was doing this, you and Heidi Bryan. So would you mind saying a little bit about that, and then how that ended up resulting in a book that you wrote?
Sure. So I got started back in 1996. I was a college student and had recently attempted suicide, and was trying to figure out resources for myself as resources for my peers, and then got involved in kind of the national suicide prevention movements, and that happened around the same time that we were trying to get towards the first national strategy. So I hopped on board pretty much the same time that the nation was shifting towards a public health framework. There weren't really any other suicide attempt survivors at that time. I felt that it was a perspective that needed to be included. So I was willing to step forward and do that because I really strongly believed that that was important. So I've been now doing that for like 23 years. I've focused on bringing that lived experience perspective into suicide prevention. And along the way, completed my undergrad degree and then doctoral training in clinical psychology, and then postdoctoral training specifically in suicide prevention. And have gone on to do various aspects of suicide prevention since then, including published writing and doing a lot of research and talking.
Your book is about, would you summarize your book in a few sentences and tell us the name of it? Because I think it's, there's not that many people who are out about their suicidal experiences. There's very few that look anything like you. And there's very few that go on to write a book about their experience.
Yeah, so the book I think you're talking about is 8 Stories Up, An Adolescent Chooses Hope Over Suicide, published by Oxford University Press. And that mixes together, it merges my personal experience with suicide, as well as specific information written for teens about suicide prevention, so that they understand kind of what's happening, and they have a narrative to go along with that they might be able to identify with, and that might be able to grant them what I talk about is authentic hope, because you see the authentic pain, it gives you reason to have authentic hope. And so that's what I want to try to do with the book, and so that it merges those two. It merges the personal perspective as well as that more informed perspective of kind of providing them with information.
That makes a lot of sense. Bringing together like the statistics and the like book knowledge with the heart piece. Were you, for people who are curious about telling their own story, was this something that you were really afraid of? Do you remember the first time you spoke out loud about it? And how did you get yourself to do that? I mean,
yeah, the first time was at a one of the national conferences that happened in DC, one of the national awareness events, and I was asked to speak to it a little bit. And it happened that at that awareness event, there were some folks there from CNN who were working on a story about the increase in African-American youth suicide at that time. And so I ended up being on CNN pretty fast. So I was like 97 or something like that. It was on CNN, so pretty fast. And it was just believing that somebody needed to talk about it. Somebody needed to present that perspective. and that if I could have, I probably would have stayed in the background. Tend to be more of an introvert if possible, but there wasn't really anybody, but it's something that I strongly believed in, and so then I was outspoken about it. And honestly, I think at the time I felt like I didn't have much to lose but a lot to gain. And so it felt like it would be able to possibly help some other people to not reach the same point that I had reached, or to help people who had hit that point be able to recover.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find most useful to think about in talking about lived experience is like, it's not about me, it's to that person who might benefit from hearing about this. And all this other distraction and worry is not important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Zachary, can you, if you can hear us, can you speak up and ask your second question?
Can you guys hear me? Is that unmuted?
We can hear
you. Awesome. So kind of like a follow-up, do you think there needs to be more kind of, kind of tying in the whole lived experience idea, like longitudinal holistic analysis of like, looking at a person is not like this, snapshot. It's like if you're watching a movie, right? You don't want to just look at one scene and use that to extrapolate like the whole movie. You want to kind of view it as this progression, not just focusing on like risk factors, stuff like that, but looking at, growth and like holistic growth. I feel like a lot of literature sometimes focuses on, risk factors, this or that. And I really appreciate when, especially when people come forth and they say like, this is literally how my life went for the past 20 years, almost like you did. And I think that can be highly informative of, that authentic hope of, people to see realistically that way kind of forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that the field, because it has had that suicide focus, that risk focus, the longitudinal studies we've had have been in terms of a person's risk over time. So we have things like the likelihood that somebody would die by suicide after having a suicide attempt. But we don't have very much in terms of how a person's life might have improved after that. And so because that hasn't been the focus, we don't really have the information about it. We know that it has happened. We know that people have done it. But a lot of times as well, what happens is because of the stigma, if somebody has recovered to the point where it's no longer showing, they might want to hide it, if possible, because there's a lot of negative consequences that could happen for sharing. And so that's one of the reasons why I focus as well on some of the personal disclosure aspects of it. But as things have kind of progressed over time, particularly in the last several years, where people are more able to disclose about their personal lived experience, I think as we increase the number of people who are willing to do that and able to do that in a safe way, we will have more of an opportunity to do that type of longitudinal study of how a person's life may have gone in a positive trajectory after a suicidal crisis.
Thank you. I have to end in a moment here. Zachary, do you mind saying a sentence or two about who you are and where you're at? And DeQuincy, do you mind throwing up the last slides?
Sure.
Yes. So I'm an undergrad. I'm a senior at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm a psychology student and obviously interested in the field and kind of incorporating these like lived experiences and improving these types of things.
Fantastic. So glad you're here, and thank you for your excellent questions. You can find us on social media, on Twitter at Unite Survivors, Facebook at Unite Survivors, and our website is unitesurvivors.org. Our next speaker our next event is two speakers. This will be a discussion of children who grieve. So a discussion about how children experience suicide loss. I get this question a lot, like how do we talk to somebody who has just lost a parent to suicide? And our speakers will be Karen Moyer, who's a national expert and co-founder of the Moyer Foundation, now called the Aluna Foundation. It's a nonprofit to support children who've experienced loss. And then Sebastian Slobin, who lost his father as a young boy and wrote a book, Ashes in the Ocean, about that. I hope that you will join us on February 12th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time next month for this webinar. Everyone who's joined us, thank you very much. We had an excellent speaker and we appreciate you as well. Thank you, Dr. Lezine. We hope to see you all next time.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Everybody share this on Facebook if you don't mind. I sent a link.
Awesome.
Okay. Bye.